16 years since that historic apology.
For the breaking up of families and communities, we say sorry.
Anniversaries matter deeply, but what will shape the future is the actions we take now.
The Closing the Gap agreement has been weak, contradictory, uncoordinated and slow.
Closing the gap? Well, that's just a dirty word in our community. It means nothing.
The anniversary of the national apology to the stolen generations has become one of the big symbolic fixtures on the parliamentary calendar. Beyond the commemoration of the trauma the stolen generations faced, there has been in most years the all too often bleak report back on how governments are going in trying to close the gap between the life outcomes of black and white Australia. Answer: never will.
This new partnership on closing the gap will set concrete targets for the future.
The gap is being closed. This is a moment to savour.
This 7th Closing the Gap report is in many respects profoundly disappointing.
We are still not making enough progress.
But there has been a particular heaviness leading up to this year's anniversary in the wake of the Australian people's rejection of last year's referendum on an Indigenous voice to Parliament.
Of course, we respect the referendum result. The preceding debate brought into sharp focus the disadvantage and inequality endured by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people.
But while the referendum might have brought Indigenous disadvantage into sharp focus, there has been a ringing silence from the government since its defeat about both its broader ambitions and its immediate priorities in Indigenous affairs. In particular, the future of the other arms of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, treaty-making, truth-telling and a Makarrata Commission, have been left uncertain. The ringing silence started to be addressed today.
As we take the time needed to get Makarrata and truth-telling right, the work of treaty goes on at a state and territory level. There will be a diversity of processes reflecting the diversity of First Nations across the continent. And we will respond to their progress while focusing on our immediate responsibilities: closing the gap, self-determination and tangible outcomes, particularly in jobs, housing, education, health and justice.
There is still, Laura, so much hurt out in the Aboriginal community and dismay, I think, at the outcomes of the referendum.
The PM said today that an Indigenous voice was never the end, but a means to an end, with the end being reconciliation and closing the gap in life expectancy, education and housing. Today, the government outlined some significant new policy developments, starting with fixing the contentious policy that has long been at the heart of federal interventions in Indigenous communities, the Community Development Program.
Today I announced the creation of our Remote Jobs and Economic Development Program. This is a better approach. It will fund community organisations to create 3,000 jobs in remote areas. Real jobs with proper wages and decent conditions. Jobs developed in partnership with Indigenous communities.
The Community Development Program, under various names, has been in place for decades. It has essentially been a glorified work for the dole program rather than one that funded real jobs.
I mean, I went to a community about 2 years ago and there were rocks that were painted purple. I can't imagine that that was what the community wanted. There was no real conditions. It was a replacement for work for the dole in many communities, and it wasn't community driven. This will be proper jobs. This will be proper conditions.
Look, I think the first thing that's different, $700 million, that's an incredible commitment. 3,000 jobs in regional and remote areas where we know jobs don't exist.
The $700 million will just fund the jobs rather than infrastructure where the nurses, aged care workers or teachers, for example, will work. But Minister Linda Burney says a lot of those facilities are actually in place but have just been impossible to staff until now.
This funding is for the actual positions, and many communities have childcare centres. I've been to communities that have aged care facilities, and they're really hard to staff, and to have First Nations people that can be trained up and take those positions is really what this is about.
The other big announcement today has been a long time coming. The establishment of an Indigenous Children's Commissioner to advocate for Indigenous kids.
Elections are won and lost on our children. Referendums can be based on our children, and yet the outcomes for our children don't change. A lot of that is because if you look at the more than 30 inquiries and reports into Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children over the past 30 years, every single one of them has pointed to a series of system failures. Do our children actually have what they need in order to be safe? Are families well supported so that they can create a safe family?
Catherine Liddle is the acting convener of the Coalition of Peak Community-Controlled Organisations, so sees at the coalface how both a new jobs program and Children's Commissioner could make a big difference.
When we look at the system failings, we are very, very good at supporting foster carers to wrap around these children. What we haven't done is give the same level of support to the families that actually look after children. If you're in a remote community where services aren't available, your child might be removed from you, not because you're failing to care for them, but because the doctor and specialist services aren't there.
The opposition today acknowledged both the collective effort and the collective failures in the past by both sides of politics.
Mr Speaker, the government's announced a $707 million program to create 3,000 remote jobs over 3 years through the funding of community organisations. It's an admirable aim.
But
we call on the government to identify the specifics of this program. It's too important to allow it to be an aspiration not achieved.
Which brings us to the question of who will be overseeing these new schemes at the federal level. Speculation that Linda Burney may leave her ministerial job and or be appointed the next Governor-General is rife. She says she still has a lot to do.
I have things to do, and there are so many Australians, both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal, that are eminently qualified for that important position. I know that the Prime Minister's giving it a great deal of thought, and I have every faith he'll make the right decision.